SOC analysts are often overworked and underappreciated. In fact, many consider leaving their jobs or changing careers altogether. Devo is hosting the 4th annual SOC Analyst Appreciation Day to give analysts long overdue kudos and encourage organizations to improve their job satisfaction and mental well-being. Join Devo and other cybersecurity industry professionals on October 16th for sessions and panels focused on de-stressing, SOC career development, and more. Visit securityweekly.com/Devo to register.
Application Security Weekly delivers interviews and news from the worlds of AppSec, DevOps, and all the other ways people find and fix software flaws. Join us as we explore how the latest news highlights modern security practices or reminds us of the missing ones. We also bring insights from interviews on topics from training to threat modeling, from open source tools to cloud-native techniques, plus an occasional reference from new wave to synthwave. Find us at securityweekly.com/subscribe or look for Application Security Weekly wherever you pick your podcasts.
Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. Quick announcement before we dive into it. Stay up to date with Security Weekly on X, of course, formerly known as Twitter. For the latest show clips and updates, you can follow at Sec Weekly and stay connected with the cybersecurity community. We've added Mr. Lee Neely to the news discussion. Lee, welcome.
Good to be here. Good to see everybody.
Hey, man, it's good to have you.
Yeah.
You've been out and about, haven't you, Lee?
A wee bit. Yeah.
Out and about.
Yeah.
That is good. Let me bring up the show notes for this episode. Where do you folks want to? I know, Mandy, you had you said you might need to drop early. So if there are stories that you would like to cover, speak now or forever hold your peace.
Okay, I think we definitely got to talk about the Windows O-Day and the Lazarus Group. North Korea, I think that's your 6.
Yes, it's a good place to start. You know, it's interesting. In the top of the show, I mentioned that, like, why would you bring your own vulnerable driver if one already exists on the system? And what I gleaned from this article and the observations by, I think, a few different companies is that North Korean nation-state attackers, this is pretty funny because we talked about nation-state attacks last week, right? But North Korean nation-state attackers were like, well, there's a vulnerability in, what was it, like AFD sys or something like that. There's basically a vulnerability in a Windows driver that's already installed.
Yeah.
So as an attacker, yes, I can bring my own, but I feel like if you are bringing your own software, I think we had a couple of stories that talk about that. Why wouldn't you just exploit what is there? And that's exactly what they did. It was called the FUD module variant. Bypass key Windows defenses such as endpoint detection and response and protected process light. PPL is another thing that I've noticed in some Black Hat research as well. And I am not the world's foremost expert on Windows exploitation. Just throwing that out there. I rely on others for some of that information. I've reached out to actually Sean Metcalf to come on the show and talk about some of these techniques. But protected process light is something that in the ORAM Black Hat talk that was given, they talked about how if you can hide and execute code inside of PPL, I might be phrasing that wrong, the EDR does not have privileges into PPL protected code if it's signed by certain other Windows components, is what was stated in the slides for that ORAM talk. So the fact that loading a driver or taking advantage of one that's already there gives an attacker access to that, like all these pieces are starting to come together, that like this is where it's at in terms of, hey, I'm on a system, I want to persist, I want to get around the protections, I want to maintain some stealth, that this is what I'm doing. And that's exactly what happened here. And it looked like it was also like a kit that so like it wasn't necessarily North Korea that developed it, like they bought this off the shelf from someone else. I don't know what else you guys gleaned from this one.
Well, so I think the line in here in this in this article is that why bring your own when you can just use that one that already exists? Is because I mean, honestly, that's very difficult, right? Like that finding that vulnerability that already exists in systems is not something that everyone could possibly do, right? And so
right, and
the like
also like it's got a limited time frame too. Like
that's right.
eventually, when you do
When
this,
you use
as
it,
what
it's burned.
happened,
It's
people are going
burned.
to notice, and then it's going to get patched.
Yeah, that's right. So they called that the holy grail for the hackers because it was baked in directly into the OS. So I agree with that. But so that's the thing that really came out for me. Now I also say that it's the holy grail, but every month we receive
Hmm.
security patches from Microsoft, so we know that they exist, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a matter of them being found, right? And then who are you going to burn it on?
Right, right. You got. What's interesting as an attacker, you got to pick who you're going to burn it on.
Mhm.
It's got to have the. I think for the Lazarus group, right? And again, I'm not the most like up to speed on all the nation state attacker motivations, but from what I've gleaned over the years, Lazarus wants to make money to fund the North Korean government,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if I'm Lazarus group and I find this, there's people within that group that are like, well, we can use this to monetize now, and we'll make enough money, and then when it gets burned, we'll move on to the next thing.
Well, that makes sense with kind of more what I researched on it because it looked like from Avast, they said this was usually used from the Lazarus group through a remote access Trojan known as KLN Rat,
Mm-hmm.
but that the FUD module was only loosely integrated and that what you were talking about before, that the rootkit, apparently they seem to only use in very specific instances, which when I was reading more seemed to be like when attacking cryptocurrencies.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah.
Like as a cryptocurrency, like if you're the victim of that, I think you're kind of honored. Like, wow, they decided to use this on me. Like, I'm so honored. It's like it's awesome.
I'm looking at this going, this is, effectively living off the land. I mean, you're using what's on the system against it. It's
Yep.
like it's really smart
Yeah.
because
Which, going back to what you were talking about rating, I was kind of surprised it only had what, a 7.2,
Oh,
I think.
Yeah. You know why? Because it's privilege escalation.
Mhm.
So that lowers the score. It's the AV attack vector. So when you see the CVSS score, it's AV colon, and I think it's local, remote, and one other value that I can't remember off the top of my head, like not applicable or something like that. But definitely attack vector, local versus remote, impacts the score in however they define it in CVSS, whether you're 3.1 or 4.0 or whatever.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I truly believe, and again, this is my and I've talked about this on the show before, right? This is my prediction that um, attack, like malicious actors, nation state or not, it's very clear from just this instance and several others that their goal is to evade detections and preventions like EDR and
Mhm.
Windows protections and maintain stealth and persistence. And right now, they're achieving those goals by manipulating drivers. Drivers give them that elevated privilege, enough of an elevation of privilege to then bypass protections. As we as an industry start to shore up our defenses against the driver attacks, whether it's on the system or you're bringing your own, attackers aren't just going to stop and be like, oh, well, that stinks, I'm just going to give up now and go into farming or something else, right? They're going to go, no, wait, how else could I achieve the same goal? And of course, as you all well know, the answer is I'm going to move before the operating system, right? I'm going to move into attacking bootloaders. I'm going to move into attacking UEFI or BMCs or management engines. They give me a higher privilege than what drivers even give me. If you've ever seen the rings, right, with all the different colors, you've got the ME and BMCs at the center of the ring. -3 is what they call that, right? Then they've got UEFI is ring -2, ring -1 is hypervisors, ring 0 is kernel, ring -2 or something like that is the next ring out is drivers. So I just think they're going to start going towards the center of those rings to accomplish their goals.
I have an idea, Paul.
Mm.
On the previous segment, we were talking about how do you determine when to patch, what to patch, prioritization, and so on and so forth. In as much as we are always talking about vulnerabilities on the news segment, I think we should end each article with either the Security Weekly score or Paul's score patch this immediately, patch it in a week, patch it in a month, and that'll solve the problem. So what Paul says, or what we
Paul's gonna
say.
tell
My
everyone to install Linux, and then
no,
and
no,
then
no, no,
every week it'll be
no,
a different
no, dude,
distribution.
because
Yeah.
in this particular case, it's even worse in Linux. When we start forcing Linux attackers to go to, modules in the kernel, there is a ripe attack surface there, even more so than Windows. I'll be the first to admit that. This is one you got to patch, right? Like, it's being exploited in the wild. My take on it is applying, and because I haven't seen anything that says, oh my god, if you apply this Windows patch, like, things can go sideways and horribly wrong. So given those factors, I would say, Jeff, you need to patch this one, and it's relatively low operational risk, again, based on kind of that crowdsource thing of, I haven't heard people going, my system crashed when I applied this update.
All right, you heard it here on Paul's Security Weekly.
Mandy, any other ones that were interesting to you?
Yes, let's go back to the Ryzen 3000.
Yes,
That's number 5.
Yeah, so this is patching the sinkclose vulnerability, which we don't have a lot of really good information about it. Researchers from IOActive disclosed a vulnerability in AMD processors that allows an attacker to escalate into SMM. And SMM is your, I forget what number it is. It privilege level outside of your management engine or BMC. Kind of, it's the next ring out in SMM or system management mode. If you want to learn more about system management mode, we did an interview with my coworker Jesse Michael, where we talked for an hour about just system management mode. So you can go pull that from the archives. So IOActive researchers disclose a vulnerability in AMD processors that allow an attacker to escalate to that mode. Now, the announcement that we got this week, because I think we talked about sinkclose last week as well. This week, AMD says we're going to support Ryzen 3000 with the security patch, even though they're not supported. We're going to support those processors as well. Now, what most articles are kind of missing out on is that with desktop CPUs, and I've done some like light validation of this, including looking at my own systems, that you can't just apply a CPU microcode update to fix this vulnerability, to fix sinkclose. You have to apply the AGISA update from AMD. Now, what I'm told by someone on Mastodon is that for their server level processors, you can kind of pick and choose which component of AGISA that you want to update. For your desktop processors, you need an AGISA update, which is basically like multiple types of firmware and CPU microcode bundled in one update. On desktop processors, you got to update AGISA, which means you have to take a UEFI update from your OEM, such as ASUS in my case, that then through the UEFI update updates your AGISA version. So I'm actually vulnerable to sinkclose on one of my systems that I was able to validate this week. The tools for doing that on Linux systems are not great. Like, I basically had to use the software from my day job to determine that I was vulnerable, right? And it shouldn't be that case. Look, I don't want that to be the case. I'm just putting that out there. Like, there is utilities on Windows, but there's also like a lot of people posting on forums like, how do I figure out what version of AGISA I have and how do I update? There's a lot of confusion on this. And rightfully so, because it is pretty complex. So like, basically when people are saying you need to apply these patches from AMD, like, dude, you're not applying the patches from AMD. You're waiting from your OEM like MSI or Asus or Dell or Lenovo or whoever it is to bundle this to get the update. So here I am, I'm sitting here, just waiting for this update to happen. Also, what I'm noticing in the industry is AGISA is being phased out in favor of an open source implementation from AMD called OpenSIL that they announced last year or the year before, and that's starting to take shape. So they're basically replacing the AGISA code with open source code that does the equivalent, and they're starting to bake that into some of their server platforms that'll eventually be like the platform firmware for AMD processors. I find AMD to be somewhat confusing Intel is to a certain extent, but it's somewhat confusing to determine if I'm vulnerable and if I've been fixed, right? Because like ZenBleed was a bug in AMD processors, and I got a microcode update from Linux firmware to fix it. But it was super hard for me to determine like what version am I running, and did I get the fix, and how did I get the fix, and did the fix apply correctly? I validated that manually on my system. Like I basically ran the ZenBleed exploit before the patch, and I'm like, holy crap, it totally worked. Like I can read data from other processes in memory that I shouldn't be able to read as a regular user, and I did. The update got applied. I ran the exploit again. It didn't work. But not everyone's going to that level to validate that. So it's one of my concerns that I have today, is to make that process easier for people. You can tell I spend a lot of time on this one. It's squarely in my day job. So I tried to include not a lot of day job related stories this week. I'm trying to get better about that. But this one we had to talk about. So, but the good news is if you're running older Ryzen 3000 processors, you will hopefully eventually get an update. All right, I've talked enough. Someone else talk now.
So I want to talk about the Defcon talk that was canceled and then uncanceled. And
hell yeah,
that's what I want to talk about. So, who I don't know. Does anybody know the background on this story,
dude? Yeah. Well, so I don't, but I read the article. So, what article is that of mine?
It is 13.
Yeah. So researchers were going, hey, I'm going to present at DEF CON about bypassing certain electronic locks. And they had presented about it at previous conferences, which is odd. But because there's a lot of eyes on DEF CON, the vendor, who I believe had not responded to any of their correspondence to say like, hey, your locks are vulnerable and here's how we can bypass them, said like, oh, you're now going to present about DEF CON. Well, guess what? 3 days before your talk, here's a cease and desist letter. In the cease and desist letter, we actually have Lee Kim, who I spoke with today, who's an attorney and Ein's faculty member, in very up to speed on cybersecurity legislation, is going to talk about this in a lot more detail as well, coming up at some point in the near future. And so when I read the article, the cease and desist letter threw the book at the presenters. Like if you were a presenter and you received a letter that said like, look, you're in violation of the Copyright Act, the Defend Trade Secrets Act, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, and we're going to sue the pants off you if you give this talk. Like any one of us on the show or listening would be like, holy crap, I am screwed. But what I believe the EFF got involved and fired back and was like, they are in no way in violation of any of these laws, and here's why, and like basically spelled it out. Like the copyright thing was they put the logo for the company in their slides, and the EFF was like, that's fair use. Like they're just representing your company in the slides. They're not pretending to have a company that does what you do. Like they're just saying like, this is the company and here's your logo, and that's not in violation of the Copyright Act.
Nope.
But again, I'm not an attorney, so I'm not like, don't be like, if you're going to give a talk and you get the same cease and desist letter and you're like, I heard Paul on the show and Paul said it was totally fine for me to give this talk. That's not what I'm saying. No. Consult with your attorney. If you get a legal correspondence, you should not listen to what we say in the show. Even if it is an attorney on the show, you should consult with your attorney on these matters. And so luckily, the
Paul is authoritative for patch or not patch, but not for present or not present. Just throwing it
right.
out.
You gotta consult with your attorney on those matters.
Yes.
So they also said like the Digital Millennium Copyright Act has provisions that we've talked about on the show in the past, like right to repair, like you own the device. Also, Computer Fraud and Abuse Act was they're not accessing like unauthorized access to a computer system. They own the computer system because they bought it. Therefore, you cannot enforce the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. And again, I'm just regurgitating what I read in the article. I'm not an attorney. I'm not giving legal advice. But so they ended up negotiating with the company they decided, I think they told them they'd remove their logo because that's like whatever.
Okay.
And the company wanted other things, like to not disclose certain things. They were like, no, we're not going to do that. We're still going to present this. So they came to an agreement. The talk was delayed. It was supposed to be on Friday or Saturday, but the talk went on Sunday.
So for any of those companies out there who are like that are trying to squash this security talk, this is the Barbara Streisand effect in
Oh,
motion, right?
dude, like
Like
totally,
so,
Yeah.
this
totally.
talk would have probably. So I don't know Dennis. I think it's Geis is his
Mm-hmm.
name, but I'm aware of him. He's done some amazing research over the years. A lot of the robot vacuums, like
Yeah.
like he's done that. That's him. If you ever like, I remember I was like 3 hours deep in one of his YouTube videos, and I looked down and my Roomba is in a trillion pieces. And I'm like, what am I doing?
That's
Like,
awesome.
why do I need root on my Roomba? Like all I
Yeah,
really want
because I
yeah,
want it,
yeah,
because
yeah,
I can.
yeah,
It's because
but
you can,
yeah,
right?
but because of him. But I mean, like, this talk probably would have gone. I'm sure it was a great talk. I'm not talking down on it, but it would have flown under the radar
Right.
for Defcon. But now because you did this, it's making headlines, right? We should have never done that. But from what just reading through here, it's a lot of the same attacks that we've talked about before, and even it brought in a flipper, which I thought was interesting. As part of his attack chain on once again attacking the electronic locks in hotels and in safes, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I just think I really like this research. As a responsible gun owner, right? I keep my guns in a gun safe. But going and looking at the vulnerabilities of the gun safe is really really interesting to me,
Yeah,
right?
like
So
if you
I want to know
if
what
you
these
want to believe that your gun safe is secure, don't go look at all of the information about how to hack into gun safes,
for
because then you'll
sure.
be like, oh my god.
But
But you'll end up like what I do, and Bill, you probably do something similar.
yep,
Is I end up adding multiple layers of defense, right? Like
100%. Yep,
I put it
one.
in a locked room, and then I put it in a locked safe, but then I also have a camera, and if anyone trips the camera, it sends an alert to my phone, and that's how I end up doing it, because anyone can get around. My kids have gotten around these locks. Not that they're going to mess with guns, because they
Yeah,
know better, and I don't make it like a mystery. We could have like a whole conversation about that. But getting around these things is often just like a YouTube search away, or if you've got a crowbar or a
yeah,
screwdriver, you can get around some of this stuff, and it doesn't offer that level of protection, which is why I always recommend, like, basically my rule of three: locked room, locked safe, and a camera.
hmm
When it's things that can be used for like extremely harmful means.
We used to call that defense in depth, Paul.
Yeah, I don't know. I hate the term defense in depth because I think it's been used the wrong way, but
Yep.
it is a term that we've used to describe that, Jeff, right? And short of a better term, yeah, I see
How
where you're going.
about
So
tertiary containment?
yeah, there you go.
Yeah, like you need just like multiple layers, I guess, is I don't
So
know.
The
Anyway,
problem is my gun safe is in the closet, and the camera footage just got a little too spicy, if you know what I mean.
yeah, that can
So
happen too. Cameras are, yep, you gotta, yep,
but regardless, bringing it back to the article, like these physical attacks need to be known, right? And these companies need this was free security testing for their
right,
product, right? Like
right.
then make it these attacks make it better, right? Make
Mm-hmm.
it better. And I think this is great research, and I'm actually really looking forward to watching this talk. I didn't was not able to see it on Sunday at DEF CON. I left early, so but really looking to watch that.
and I'm betting they called out those statements that they were given to read, that they told us we have to say this. So there was no question they were being forced to say there's never been a break in these locks since whatever the hell date it was. Um,
Well, I think to your point, Lee, I think they had them remove the
yep.
trivially
That's a hard word.
exploited. Yeah, the like
Yeah,
they
easy and
didn't want them
trivial.
saying like, oh, this is like really easy to do, because that's somewhat subjective. And I think they were worried about brand reputation.
Right.
And the researchers did agree to like, well, okay, we won't say like this is easy to do, because I mean, maybe for some of us it's easy. I'd also argue that if it just requires a screwdriver or whatever, I would term that as easy as well, and I might fight them on that. But it didn't sound like that was the case
Right. So
for this.
they had to add a statement from DigiLock, which thanked them for the delay, but it also said in over 32 years, there have been no reported instances of items being stolen because a DigiLock was hacked, and they're fully committed to providing secure solutions to its customers. I mean, that's like, really? You're in the lock business. I would hope you're committed to providing secure solutions.
Right. Yeah, they're just trying to cover they're trying to save their brand reputation at that point. Yeah.
I'm thinking they're trying, they sold us to say this, and we're throwing up a little bit as we do. Because Defcon, that speakers have fun.
I think
But we're also
missing.
I mean,
Go ahead, Mandy.
well, this information was also presented already at NullCon in Berlin, and I like how the article calls out like it received very little attention. I'm like, I'm sorry to the speakers, but okay, it didn't have very much attention at all. So why? We've already covered it, but like, why now?
A lot of it depends on the use case, right? Like if you're just putting a lock on your gym locker and you want to prevent like the casual person just from getting at your stuff, then a lot of these locks provide adequate protection. But now what we're getting into is, well, what level is that, right? Like what level of attacker are you trying to protect against? And this goes for your locks on your house, on your locker, on your guns, whatever. Like you got to think about your threat model. And then, more advanced defenders will be like, okay, if I'm protecting against a more advanced threat attacker, then I got to pay attention to this stuff. But most people are using these locks, again, making sure their bike doesn't get stolen, which is almost a lost cause. I forget what city someone was telling me. Was it New York? And someone was like, it didn't matter what kind of lock you put on your bike. Like they had the equivalent, like, it's not a welder, but it's like a torch cutter, like in the truck, right? Like, so a big enough of like a metal cutting apparatus that required like a van, and they would just go up and cut whatever lock you had on there and take your bike, right? Like, so it doesn't matter what kind of lock you have on there, like they're getting at your bike. So
right. Or maybe instead of cutting the lock, they cut the chain.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they're just cutting the chain.
I mean,
exactly.
in your gun safe example, when I had mine delivered, I was asking about the security of the lock, and they said, the heck with that. They'll go through the back. It's the thinnest part of the safe.
Right. Well, yeah, and I think it was Deviant that it said like you can flip a safe over on the bottom, and if it's some kind of concrete or whatever, you just whack it with a sledgehammer and it falls apart and get it. I mean, you can see a million videos online about. I follow people on Instagram, right, that are lock pickers, safe cracker kind of people.
So like my threat model for my gun safe is me as a 16-year-old, right? That's my threat model. Like like I'm not up to, like, I'm not trying to hurt anybody. I'm just like, hey man, I want to get in. I don't know what's in there. I want to get in there.
Yeah.
Right? Like that. Right. That's my threat model. I'm not going to be flipping things over and smashing them, but I'm
because then your parents are going to know that you did that.
That's right.
Yeah.
But there's an allegory here to our whole conversation about patching and risk and what do you fix and what do you don't, because we spend so much as a industry and society on the really good lock when there's a million other ways to get what you want. And we're not willing to pay for all the different protections and layers of protection and other things. And yet, but that's really what you have to do, as Paul was saying. You can't just rely on one point of failure. You got to have.
That's why I like,
for lack of a better term, layers.
I like surveillance and cameras as part of it. My contractors locked themselves out of my side shed, and I had a lock on there that we've talked about on the show, and they're starting to bring out like screwdrivers and crowbars, and I was like, no, like I'm coming, I'm going to unlock it for you. I'm like, but secondly, if you really wanted to get in the lock, like you just need a small like Allen key, and if you undrew the like 6 screws on the back of it, you could pop that off and get to the lock. So it just requires like a different, it's not brute force, right? Like you were going for, which might work, don't get me wrong, but it might leave evidence you were there. But you want to take apart, that lock from the back, and that's how you get into it. So, but my saving grace was I had a camera, like I saw them on the camera. But again, if you're not home or you're sleeping, you might not be monitoring your camera. Yes, it can send you alerts, but there's a failure rate there as to whether or not the alert gets sent or whether or not you're going to pay attention to that alert.
Yeah, there is that.
I have a story that I feel like applies here somehow. But
Go for it.
Okay, talking about the gun safe, securing the guns. In the past, house was burglarized and had 2 shotguns and 2 handguns that were in pieces, separated in pieces, hidden all over the house, with only certain parts held in a safe underneath the carpet in the pad and everything. So somebody broke in and apparently spent, going back to, it's probably 16-year-old Bill, because they spent all day there drinking juice, watching cartoons, finding things, stringing the underwear throughout the hallways and like all over the place, took a shower, just messed things up in general, and had found about 3/4 of what was needed for one shotgun, half of what was needed for another one, and a part, never got it all together, and then came home. They ran out the back door. I just feel like it takes a lot of parts here of what we've been talking about, and they didn't actually get it put together. They didn't actually get to use any of the firearms, and they abandoned even the parts.
But what's funny is I have the same story about my Linux server that got hacked. Like someone hacked into my Linux server and like used like user land to like generate cryptocurrency. And I was like, well, if you had paid attention, like there was some pretty heinous UEFI vulnerabilities that if you really wanted to, you could have persisted on that system pretty much forever. Or you could have like really screwed that system so I could never use it again. Like you pick, but you didn't do any of that, right? And luckily I had my day job software on there, so I knew what they did and didn't do in that realm. But it was the same thing as you're saying, right? Physical versus attack on my Linux server. I'm like, oh, I know what you did. Like I can clean up what you did. But if you had persisted further, that could be bad. Had they broken the safe and put the guns together, could have been a different story. Yep. Same thing on my Linux server. Which does anyone still dual boot Linux and Windows? I know a lot of people do.
Not for a long time.
Yeah, me too. Not for a long time. I have dedicated Linux. I have dedicated Windows. I have dedicated.
Me too. Me too. I mean, I'll admit, as a Linux user, I still have dedicated Windows boxes. And I think a lot of Linux, well, maybe not every Linux user will admit that. So it's probably a higher number that do, but like myself, Hal Pomerantz, we're fully transparent. I have Windows machines, physical Windows machines as well, because I hate dual booting. I think I was scarred early on in my career when it comes to dual booting. Just even before secure boot, like it was just awful. Like it was just a pain to maintain. It never worked right. I did it, and I was like, this machine's either going to be Linux or Windows. Like I'm not going to try and do both. But a lot of people apparently still do. And so my story number one is the Ars Technica article by Dan Gooden that I don't want to say he misrepresented, but it also, to his credit, this whole thing is really confusing. So it's confusing from Microsoft. Some of the way Dan wrote stuff is a little confusing. Again, I want to say borderline like inaccurate, but also to his credit and everyone else's credit, this is not easy to understand. Like the whole thing is really confusing. So
was it inaccurate, or was he just trying to sort of simplify it to make it a little bit easier to understand?
It could have been some of that, Jeff, as well. So I'll try and make sense of this. So Microsoft published a security bulletin, pushed out a patch, and what they mean by patch in this sense is they are trying to protect Windows from bootloaders that have known vulnerabilities. Now, a bootloader that has a known vulnerability that has been signed by Secure Boot should have a corresponding entry in like a revocation list that says, since this bootloader or piece of software, it doesn't have to be a bootloader, but in this case, a bootloader is vulnerable. And if that's the case, it should be in a revocation list, because that means an attacker can take control of it and circumvent Secure Boot. It's like one of the reasons why secure boot exists. Vulnerable software ends up in a revocation list. If you have that software, secure boot is up to date. Secure boot should say, I can't boot the system because I can't ensure boot integrity. And this was obviously it put into place by Intel and Microsoft, were the primary companies behind creating secure boot to overcome the limitations of BIOS, where it was just the Wild West. There was none of these protections. So Microsoft issues a patch that kind of gets labeled as they're patching Grub, right? Because Grub has a vulnerability. But in actuality, what Microsoft did was they updated a form of a revocation list that tells secure boot, you cannot trust this particular version of the bootloader. So I gotta give some background now. So Eclipsium researchers disclosed vulnerabilities in Grub that we dubbed boot hole that forced the industry, right? It's great. It's a great name. It's like images of boots with like holes. Worms
Did you make
coming
a
out. It's great.
logo? Okay.
Yeah, there is a logo with a boot with a worm coming out of it that we used as a logo. We did.
Okay.
But basically it forced like 150 different hashes of different versions of Grub to be added to the revocation list. Now, the reason that's a problem is because the revocation list is stored in a variable that has a fixed length of 32 kilobytes. Just those hashes in Grub fill up like 15% of that variable. So the industry starts getting concerned that if we need to keep revoking things in this way, like we're going to run out of space, and that's going to be a really bad day.
Yeah.
So Red Hat came up with this concept that's called an SBAT. And I forget what it stands for. Secure Boot Attestation List, whatever. SBAT is the acronym. It was basically another mechanism to revoke software that shouldn't be part of the boot process because of vulnerabilities. So Microsoft recently, what this whole article is about, is Microsoft releases an update through Microsoft Windows that updates the SBAT list that says this version of Grub is no longer cool with secure boot. And SBAT is also another UEFI variable. It's not specific to Windows, which is something that's not explained in this article. So again, it's not inaccurate, but maybe not complete, right? So when Linux boots up, it reads the SBAT and goes, well, you're using a vulnerable version of Grub. Secure boot goes, I can't boot you because Linux honors secure boot in this scenario. And so people that were dual booting, Windows updates the SBAT list. When that user went to go boot Linux, Linux goes, your bootloader is not checking out with secure boot, so I can't boot the system. Now, Microsoft says this update should only apply to Windows-only systems. It should not apply to people who are dual booting. I don't know how they determine the difference between a Windows-only booting system and a Windows in a system rather that boots both Linux and Windows. I mean, I'm sure there's ways to determine that, but Microsoft didn't nail it in this case. No. And so Linux users were up in arms. And that's the basis of this. And again, the way SBAT works is really confusing, by the way. Like, I understand how secure boot revocation works. It's pretty clear. I have presentations and webinars I've given for Eclipsium where we explain it. Like, it's clear and cut and dry. I've talked about it on the show, right? SBAT is like another mechanism, and it's got a lot of nuances, and it is very complex, and Microsoft kind of screwed it up. So like people were saying, like, why is Microsoft patching Grub? They're not patching Grub.
Right.
They're updating a revocation list that says Grub can't boot Windows was their intent. Now, their intent was good because as an attacker, if I bring a vulnerable bootloader, I can bypass secure boot. And Microsoft's like, well, I don't want that. I want to say you can't boot Windows with this Grub bootloader because it has vulnerabilities. If you bring a vulnerable bootloader and you exploit the vulnerability, you can circumvent secure boot. And Microsoft's like, we want Windows to honor secure boot. That's the crux.
What standalone Windows system is using Grub to boot Windows?
Only ones that, well, you can do that.
Of course,
right? It's an option, right?
Of course, you
can. Attackers want to do that because if secure boot's enabled on a system and I'm an attacker with elevated privileges on Windows, I go install a vulnerable version of Grub.
I see.
I boot the system, I exploit a vulnerability in Grub. Now I have code execution before the operating system's loaded. And
Gotcha.
that's the scenario Microsoft was trying to protect
Right.
against.
So just
But
reading
again, reading this article and other articles, like that's not immediately clear because it's like a really complex topic.
So just reading the article here, it says that if you're experiencing this, the specific steps that you need to take are: number one, disable secure boot. And what I think is so funny about that is that's where people are going to stop. Done.
Yes, exactly. Right. You
Done.
disable secure boot, everything's fine. Right.
Fixed it.
But you got to read the next step, which is there's a command you can run in Linux that uses mockutil, machine owner key, that allows you to manipulate variables that are involved in secure boot, among other things. And you remove the SBAT update, right? Then I think you got to reboot again.
Yep.
And then you enable secure boot and reboot again. You basically have to wipe out what Microsoft put in the SBAT update.
So, wait, I was thinking that the fix would be to turn off secure boot your Linux, update it so it's not a vulnerable grub, and then return it back on.
That's a great point, Lee. You could absolutely do that. It was one of my other observations on this article is why are you running a vulnerable version of Grub? Like you should not. Yeah.
In a dual boot system, you know it's not up to keep it up to date. So it may have been asleep past the updates and they hadn't been applied yet.
It's also if you boot on a USB key, that may have an older version of Grub because it's a USB bootable device. So there's a couple of different scenarios, but you're right. You should be running software that has been updated and signed in the secure boot process, but not everyone does. There was also references to shim as well. When I read this article, some articles related to Linux and some of the Microsoft documentation, they kind of interweaved references to Grub and references to shim, which are two totally different components in the boot process. The shim and Grub are both bootloaders, right? But they're two completely different software applications.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was also confusing, and I haven't figured out did Microsoft's update invalidate both shim and Grub, or just Grub and shim? Because shim was created so that Linux users could participate in secure boot, right? It's a smaller bootloader that's kind of extrapolated away, that's signed in the secure boot process, but also allows Linux distributions to update the certificate chain within shim. So
little does Paul know this was actually a move to get everybody moving from dual boot over to WLS.
Right. Yes. One could put our tinfoil hats on and I don't think Microsoft hates Linux in this way. I think they're self-serving. They want to protect Windows users more than they want to protect Linux users, which
and in fact, their embracing of WLS, they really have come a long way in terms of warming up to Linux. I mean, they didn't have to give you the ability to run a Linux kernel under Windows, and they did. So, yeah.
So WSL, just real quick. And
sorry, thank you.
No worries. But I was such a proponent of WSL when it came out. Like, in fact, I made a bunch of videos teaching people how to get it all set up because exactly what you're talking about, Lee. Like, this was the end of dual boot. I don't need that, because now I've got Windows for what I need it for. I've got Linux what I need it for. I've backed off of that. I just ran into too many problems on the Linux side. It's great. Don't get me wrong. It's great. It's just, it's not.
So what you're saying is we need to go the other way. We need to run Linux and then run Wine to run our Windows applications.
Right. Yeah. It's actually that's apropos. That's exactly the experience I've had. So if you've ever been in
Linux, Wine is a terrible experience. That's what I'm
saying. That's exactly what I'm saying. Right.
There's no whining in podcasting.
Yeah. Yeah. So WSL and Wine, those are the exact same.
But the gaming emulation engine, what is the one that Steam created? Is it Proton? I want to say it's Proton. What is the Steam Deck runs an emulator for Linux that allows you to run like Windows-based games? I want to say someone's correcting me, but I think it's called Proton. It's similar to what we're talking about.
That's cool.
Yeah. that's what enabled the Steam Deck to run Linux and be able to support Windows gaming. And Steam did an amazing job. I believe it's called someone will correct me, but I believe it's called Proton.
Cool.
So don't dual boot. I mean, the other thing with dual booting is you can acquire devices like really cheap, right?
Yeah.
Like if you need a Windows PC or you need a Linux PC of some kind, you can get this really you can get a Raspberry Pi and you can run Linux on it, right?
Yeah.
It like a Raspberry Pi 5 with an NVMe is a pretty performant Linux desktop. I
For
bought
sure.
some pretty cheap $200 ish. It has a screen built into it. At some point I'll talk about it more on the show and do a project with it, but like it runs Windows. That one I actually do dual boot. I actually put an SD card and I run Kali Linux on it because I wanted to preserve the Windows because I'm not quite sure what I want to run natively on it, just as like an experiment. But you can get pretty cheap PCs to do. I mean, Linux you can run on the cheapest Raspberry Pi hardware. So
Mm-hmm.
dual booting should be whatever.
So that's what I realized too. And and it's a pain in the ass because a lot of times you're when you're dual booting, for me at least, hey, I just need to do this one thing, and man, it'd be so much easier if I was in Linux or I'd be in Windows or whatever if I just did it there. And then, well, but now this is my main system. I've got to shut down everything that I was doing to go do
Yes.
this one thing to come back, and so running the own hardware is the right thing to do. But so I will caution you as somebody who, just my past, hardware hacker. I've got tons of old computers laying around and stuff. Just because you have an old PC or whatever, that may not be the right one to run Linux on, just simply because over the last, like, I don't know, 10 years, like, so if your box is 10 years or older and maybe 5 years or older, just the power consumption that those old machines,
Oh, agreed.
it's just,
Yep.
it's shocking how efficient CPUs have become, just in the recent years. So it's worth the $300 to buy something new,
Right,
a
but
small
also
little.
virtualization technology has gotten a lot better over the
That's
years
true.
as well.
Oh,
I've
yeah.
got Windows VMs because there's just certain times that you have to run Windows. It's really funny. One of my friends said, "Hey, you should check out Autopsy. Have you used Autopsy, Bill? And
I
you do a lot of
have.
instant
Yep.
response."
Mm-hmm.
And so my friend was like, "Dude, you want to run Autopsy?" But he's like, and he's a big Linux person. He's like, "Dude, don't try and run it on Linux." He's like, "Get a VM and run Autopsy." I'm like, "Dude, I don't believe you. I'm on Linux. I've been doing this for 20 years. I can do it on Linux." And sure as shit, he was right. Running on Linux is a fucking nightmare.
Yeah.
Like, okay, that's one reason why I need a Windows VM. I mean, there's just certain software that doesn't run on
Yeah.
Linux. I run an audio service called Rune. That doesn't run. It make a Linux interface, right? And there's Adobe Creative Suite. There's just certain things where like you need a Windows system.
Yeah. My
Which is fine.
laser
I'm
cut.
okay with that, and I'm okay with that.
My laser cutter has Linux software, but like it's better on Windows,
It's
right?
better on yes.
Yeah.
Agree.
So,
There's something that they do make a Linux version, but it's completely crappy, and vice
yeah,
versa too. There's
for
some Linux
sure.
software I would rather use on Linux than
Mo
Windows, right?
Yeah.
In the old timers' defense, when I was running dual boot back in the day, the laptop costs like $6,000.
Right. Yes.
Right.
Hardware
That's
was a
right.
lot more expensive.
Yeah.
Great point, Jeff. Yep. Well, if our audience wants to weigh in on like, you want recommendations for us, give us some use cases. I'm happy to recommend hardware platforms to do that stuff.
Me too.
I gotta say, I used to have a Linux server just in its own little box that got replaced every few years because hardware. I bought a NUC a few years ago.
Yep.
And I actually threw EXXI on it because it was free. So now it's running in a virtualized form, and I've had to move it once when the old NUC died, but I can run other stuff on it too. I've got a Windows VM, and I've got some other stuff I throw on there every now and then. And
yeah, now Intel doesn't make the NUCs anymore. They stopped making those.
There'll be a replacement.
There's a lot, and to that point,
in
my research, B-Link is the one that makes the awesome.
Right.
Me
Also, Zima
4 or
boards
5
are
inches
awesome.
on the side.
If you want to do some hacking stuff, Zima boards are amazing. It has a PCI slot on it. It's awesome.
Oh,
Ooh,
danger, Will
PCI.
Robinson.
It's it.
Not that
Not that
PCI.
PCI.
The other PCI.
I wanted to talk about some new RFID research, the MIFARE Classic. And these are researchers from Quarks Labs who just do amazing research all around. And they released a paper that pointed out some hardware backdoors in certain MIFARE Classic chips. And these MIFARE Classic chips are not like the official MIFARE Classic. They're like basically Chinese knockoffs. FM11RF08S has a backdoor that enables an entity with knowledge of its compromise, knowledge of it to compromise all user-defined keys on these cards, even when fully diversified, simply by accessing the card for a few minutes. Take a moment to digest that. Entity with knowledge of it to compromise all user-defined keys on these cards simply by accessing. So you access one card, and we talked about this with Iceman. And I sent this research to Iceman, and I'm like, dude, is this legit? He's like, absolutely, 1,000%. This is legit. And he's like, you know, who knew that these had backdoors? And then I immediately sent him the meme, like, Mr. Potato Head, backdoors are not secrets, right? And we all had a good laugh. But it means, the way I read this is that you're in a hotel and you get issued a card. If I can clone that card and analyze the data on that card, it means I can create a master key for that entire system, that's kind of scary. Also, the tools and attacks in this paper, which is extremely technical and detailed, and I haven't gone through it all yet, but I wanted to see like where they were going with this research. And they say the various tools and attacks developed in the context of this paper have now been merged into the Proxmark 3 source code. So if you got a Proxmark device and you update firmware, you can pwn stuff like a rock star when it comes to these attacks, which is awesome. By the way, as we established in the Iceman interview, you can buy the official stuff. Look, you should buy the official stuff. You should go to our friend Garrett at Hacker Warehouse, and you should buy the official stuff, especially like if you're doing this stuff as part of your job, and it's in your critical path. If you're a hobbyist like I am, and I just want to tinker around, and when I go on vacation with the family, I want to mess around with the hotel key cards to keep myself occupied, I totally buy the knockoff gear from AliExpress, and it totally works just fine. I bought a Chameleon and a Proxmark from AliExpress, like totally fine, flashes the latest firmware. I also bought an Ubertooth 1 from China, which is a total knockoff, and it works just fine, by the way, which is awesome.
Thanks for supporting all of our friends there, Paul. You know?
Yeah, right. Well, I think the Ubertooth 1 is kind of like a deprecated platform, and like knockoffs happen, and it's totally fine. Like we've moved on to a lot of other you can go down a rabbit hole of Bluetooth and Bluetooth low energy hardware. I don't know if I put that in the story, but there was someone pointed me to hardware.io ran a training class, and I started looking through some of their materials, and the hardware they're using is a lot of NRF boards that are like $4 from AliExpress to do these attacks. And then I'm like, you just like my other story, like going down a rabbit hole with hardware. I think it was one of my last stories. My story number 16, right, is the portable router build. Like you want to have a router that you take with you. So like I Ethernet into it, and it's the Wi-Fi or LTE on the other side, and it's a gateway. And this person does like an enormous amount of research and found this Onion. I don't know if you ever heard of this, Bill. The Onion, it's not Tor Onion routing, but it's called the Onion Omega 2. Onion Omega gear. If you look at my story number 16, if you're interested in this, go to our show notes, story number 16, and you can just start going down a rabbit hole, like just based on this article and the comments. Make sure you read the comments as well. Starts recommending gear to build your own personal router, and good Lord, you can just, it's a rabbit hole. Like warning, rabbit hole. You're just going to start buying like
WRT in it. Of course you're hooked.
It comes pre-installed with OpenWrt. And this person made, it's a dual 18650 that he put in a soft-sided case. He's got Ethernet and I think he put Wi-Fi on it, and it lasts for like 20 hours.
Wow.
That's
What a nerd.
awesome
It's fucking
project,
awesome.
right?
Yeah.
Dude, like total rabbit hole.
Huh. The Onion Omega, the latest router dev board. That is cool.
And so what he said was he researched a bunch of boards, and he says even though the Onion Omega came out like a while ago, they're still actively maintaining on Git and producing new boards.
$9.
And they even make one I saw that has an LCD screen on it. It's pre-installed openware LCD screen. Like, that's awesome.
That is awesome. Speaking of awesome, the new Frack is out.
Dude, was this not a throwback?
That is so awesome. Well, you know, they've been releasing some, like, what, every couple years, I think.
Yeah, like I think I did. I traced back. I think the latest issue is 72,
71.
71, and
Mhm.
70 was like 2022. But like, I hope they're on a
2021.
regular
Yeah,
cadence now.
2021. Yeah, 2021.
Yeah, once
So-
every 4 years.
Yeah. So
I hope they're on a more frequent
what's your guys'
cadence than-
experience with Frack? Like, when did you become aware of it, and just what's that nostalgia look like for you,
dude?
guys?
Aleph 1, smashing the stack.
90s.
Probably, arguably one of the most influential, important, and seminal pieces of work in our field.
I 100% agree. And every single one of them, every single one, from the minute I found out about it until right now, I read it and I'm like, I am an idiot. I don't
Mhm.
understand.
Right.
And I just absolutely love that their level of detail and the topics that they talk about are just that. I don't know how they continue to find and produce such such. I don't know. I love it. I love every bit about it. And and as I'm reading through every single Frack, I'm like, oh my gosh, I've still got so much to learn. Like this is great.
Someone said to me early on in my career, I'm blessed to have a lot of people that like were influential in my career, even before I was doing straight security work. It was my boss at the time when I was still in college. His name was Pat, and he was like, dude, like the more you know, the more you realize you don't know.
That's right.
And this was before I was doing a lot of like straight up security work, right? Like we were doing OS2 warp and Lotus notes stuff, right?
Mhm.
And I was like, wow, that stuck with me. I'm 47 now, man, and that stuck with me like my entire career in this field. And that was just spot on. And you're right, Frack is one of those things, like just when you think you know something, like you're like, wow, I got a lot more to learn.
So I haven't read the whole thing yet, but the one that I'm probably about halfway through it. The one that really caught me was Stealth Shell, a fully virtualized attack toolchain. And so
Yes,
about
because you were talking about the THC
was.
tool.
That's
Yes,
true.
yeah, I read that, and so I did read through this issue, and I did read that, and I thought of you, Bill, because I was like, is this the same thing that Bill was talking about?
And
But
so
it's different.
it goes on for like, I don't know, 25 pages. And I was like, cool, man, that's all great. That's all great, man. That's awesome. That's great theory. But like, show me what you got. And then at the very end of the article is a basic or
Yes,
or whatever. I don't know what it is. It's like
they
ASCII,
encode the actual
ASCII
code, like rather
encoded.
than a link to GitHub, they encode the actual code in the article.
Boom. Just absolute blew my mind. I was like, well done. That was great. That goes back to like when InMap was released that way,
Right.
just unbelievable.
But if do yourselves a favor and go to the latest issue of Frack 71 and read the introduction. It reads like was the Hacker Manifesto a Frack article, or was it just a
I don't know.
text
It
file?
was separate, as I recall.
It was separate, right? But like the intro to Frack 71 reads like a 2024 Hacker Manifesto, and man, like I don't wake up like every day and read this. it just be rejuvenated. And they end it with the most prolific line ever, right? And I know I'm like waxing poetic, but like the intro ends with the very short statement: "The hacker spirit breaks any spell." Like, if there's anything that gets you charged up to like be in this field, it should be that. So exciting.
Definitely worth a read.
Now I'm curious, was the Hacker Manifesto was a separate work, not a Frack article? I thought it was a Frack article. Anyway,
I'd have to dig through my archives.
So
It
the
might take
first
a while.
Frack was
it was Frack. It was Frack magazine.
Was it?
First Frack was
Issue-
released November 17th, 1985.
Okay.
And so volume 1, issue 7 is written on January 8th, 1986. The Conscience of a Hacker by the Mentor. That is the Hacker Manifesto. It was published in Frack magazine.
There it is. I see it.
Now, goes to show you how old I am.
And then-
I had to zoom in to be able to see it with
Three articles down how to three articles down how to make TNT.
Yeah, dude. Like, you know, that's what got me fired. Quick tangent. That's what got me fired up lately when I saw this ridiculous friggin' social media trend about it. You guys all make fun of me now in our internal Signal channel. Very demure, very mindful in all these videos that are doing that. I'm like, look, like you people have like the internet. You were brought up with the internet. Us older folks did not have the internet until a certain point in our lives. You have the internet and you're using it for ridiculous things like that. When we figured out we had the internet, we published the anarchist cookbook to the internet, right? Like that's what we were doing. And like even before the internet of BBSs, that's what we use it for. Now we're doing the stupid social media shit that drives me insane. I can't take it. Sorry.
They're very lucky.
Tell us how you really feel, Paul.
Get off my lawn. That's how
Stop mincing words.
Really oh boy. Let's talk about how more shit is broken.
Well, let's shift gears a little bit.
Where do you want to go? Yeah. Jeff, let's go to one of your story and then some of Lee's stories.
Well, I think it's going to be Lee's story. I went searching for articles and my search terms are security breach. And I got pages and pages and pages of, 2.9 million records have been stolen, social security codes. I'm like, I'm not even going to bother putting up any of these articles because I saw Lee already had one. But, we would be remiss if we did not discuss it because it was sort of the big breach news of the week.
Yeah, that's national public data that originally, what is his name? The guy that released it to the dark web, not the hacker that got the data, said there was 2.9 billion with a B records, which was second only to Yahoo in terms of breach size. And by the way, the Yahoo breach was 2013. I didn't know it was that long ago. It seemed like it wasn't.
Is this the everyone's social security numbers on the internet?
Yeah. This is there. So Troy Hunt, you remember him?
Yep.
Of course.
He said he did some analysis of the data, and there's 134 million email addresses in the data breach, of which 70 million of those have associated criminal histories with them. This is a background search firm, by the way, so that's why they have that kind of stuff. Interestingly, the reason the number 134 million is interesting is because in the release that they actually put out by National Public Data to the state of Maine, they said there was only 1.34 million records. And the irony there is there are only 1.4 million in the state of Maine. So it's basically everybody in the state.
Right.
And then there's 270 million social security numbers in there. The average age is 80. And a number of them are in the 120-year-old type range, so they're obviously no longer living. So, so the question becomes one of how relevant is the breach data, but it's a crazy amount of data.
You know what's funny? Every time one of my family members, even immediate family, gets to a point where they have to put their social security number into something, and it could even be for something like they're applying for a job. or filling out a tax form, like they actually need your social security number. They're like, is it safe to put it in? I'm like, yeah, it's fine. Attackers already have your social security number.
It's like
yeah, they've got that already.
It's already on the internet.
It's public domain.
Yeah.
Pretty
It's public
much.
domain at this point.
Yeah,
It's
don't
fine.
put your email address. Social security is fine. You know.
Yeah.
Right.
No, it's so anyway.
Don't put the passcode to like unlock your cellular provider, because that's probably more protected than your SSN.
What about the pin for my lock on my gun safe?
That too. Don't make that the last 4 of your SSN, because your SSN's already on the internet and someone's just going to be able to figure it out.
Oh dear. Well, that's okay. I set it to 1, 2, 3, 4.
Password to
5.
my luggage. Yeah,
That's it.
Change the passwords to my luggage.
So anyway, the thing that gets me on this one is that National Public Data is not doing a lot of disclosure on it. That concerns me more than the discrepancies. I mean, is it 2.9 billion? Probably not. Is it only 134 million? I think it's a lot more than that. But
they probably
I'm
don't know.
Right, and
I mean, I don't know. They may be downplaying it, but they probably just don't know.
And really, the only thing we can do, I mean, this is stuff is going on. It seems like it's accelerated the last few months. There's just tons of breaches. It's like all we can do is double down on the ID protection and freezing our credit. Hopefully, you get it because you've got an offer from somebody, so you don't have to pay for it. I mean, just the other day, I got a letter from Change Health. I didn't know I was in any way associated with Change Health, but yeah. And so that was kind of like, oh, goody. Is that number 4 or number 5? I got hit by the OPM breach. So,
me too. Yeah.
And so I still have their identity theft protection.
Me too.
So, hey, like I said, well, somebody else's, but you know, the funny thing is, I made myself go back in and make sure I actually had fully configured it and didn't do a half-assed job, because it's becoming more and more important to have that set up right and monitoring everything.
Right.
I mean, when I first got it, I'm like, "Ooh, I don't know why I want to put the minimum here. I don't know if I trust these guys." Now it's
so my story number 6 was a company called ArcServe published an article that said 47% of U.S. firms, so half, have suffered a data breach resulting in severe financial loss. And the article talks about, in the millions. And of course, it also says it's mostly ransomware these days, which, I don't know, part of me thinks, yeah, but that's not a real breach. It's significant in terms of, data loss, not data loss, but loss of money and productivity. But
yeah,
it again underscores that, we've spent most of our time trying to protect against data loss. And we don't really do a good job on that availability aspect of, the data security triad.
Yeah. Well, I'm seeing more and more they don't know when they're going to be back on. I mean, I think you and I both have the story about Cleveland, right? And they're still struggling.
Yeah.
Oh, I wanted to talk about Flint, Michigan.
Oh yeah, that was one of mine.
Yep. That's one of them.
And you know what brought this up is because I'm going to GERCON in Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Yep.
And I was like, wait, I know about Michigan. It was Flint, Michigan. And I was like, wait, what happened in, I know, like, I remember like the news articles. And I think that was like pandemic times almost in Flint, Michigan. And I wasn't sure.
Well, they were having a water problem for a long time.
Yes. And so
yes, they were.
So I researched this, and apologies if I get any details wrong, but what I read briefly was that I feel bad for the folks in Flint, Michigan, because their city or town was under financial hardship. I guess a lot of automobile manufacturers had left Flint, Michigan. They were in such dire financial position that the state appointed someone to basically run the city. And in order to save money, rather than pulling it from water from one of the lakes, they pulled it from one of the rivers, and that water was contaminated. And they did that to save money. And they, like, the folk didn't have like voting power to be able to like vote on specific issues, because it was basically like a power of attorney, but for the town, so they could just make decisions without consulting with the folks that lived there. and it contaminated the water, and like a whole bunch of people got sick. In fact, people are still suffering health issues from that. I'm like, that's an atrocity. And like I remember seeing news articles, but serve as a reminder of like the horrible things that happened there.
It was
and so,
clearly
like,
a risk-based decision that somebody made.
right, it was a financial decision, right?
Well, that's the element of risk that
factor
we're
of
talking
risk,
about.
right? Yeah, it's a horrible decision. And then I was like, how is Flint, Michigan doing? Because again, I'm going to Michigan next month. So it was kind of like reading up as to the things that I had seen in the news that revolved around Michigan. And then Lee, when you posted this story, I'm like, because I read articles about like how Flint, Michigan is doing today, and it's still not great.
No.
Like there's still huge issues for these poor people living in that city. And then I see that you posted your story number 6, Lee, is they're recovering from a ransomware attack. I'm like, the last thing Flint, Michigan needed was a ransomware attack on top of everything else.
Yeah. I mean, it's horrible. I mean, they can only take cash or check for payments. They can't take electronic payments right now. They have some phone systems working. They're still delivering the water check. I didn't mention this in what I added in the comments, but
yeah,
they made sure to mention you can still get your water testing kits. And I didn't have the context you just gave me about that. I mean, I'd seen a little bit of it, but that's huge. And actually, one of the things I've been looking at lately a lot is what's in these notifications. How useful is it? And in that context, this is an incredibly useful piece of information, which didn't make sense otherwise. Why it's important to list there. And I'm thinking it's been a story of what to put in a breach notification that we could all leverage for when it's our turn. I'm wondering how many of our banking systems for online bill pay are able to dial down to a non-electronic payment if the far end isn't working.
Well, segue.
but that also sucks.
Segue, Paul.
I was just going to
Fortunately,
say, but quickly, Jeff, that sucks for the residents there. If you're in a town that has financial hardship, you might need to put the bill in your credit card, and now you can't.
Yeah.
Like, oh God, like how much does that suck?
Well, PCI doesn't care if you can transact or not, so they're PCI compliant at least. But
woohoo!
Yeah, right.
I thought it would be a good segue into your article on the mainframe pen testing, because most financial institutions are still running mainframes.
Mainframe.
You just tell that in,
probably,
right?
And that was a stroll down memory lane reading that article. Let me tell you,
right?
Oh.
But, like, I don't see a lot of information, and I know like years ago on the show we covered. I forget his handle. I want to say his name is Phil, that did a lot of mainframe hacking. There was like 1 or 2 people in our field that was evangelizing mainframe pen testing and mainframe security. And it was, I forget his handle. And we had him on the show many years ago, talk about mainframe hacking. My personal experience with that is from the university, where we had, big mainframes. And I say plural because, like, we had the mainframe that had been there for 30 or 40 years. And then we got the next one that would last us the next 30 or 40 years, which is amazing to think about, by the way. Like, I built my desktop computer 4 years ago next month, and it's still running great. But like, it's probably got a 5 or 6 year lifespan on it. And to have a mainframe that's got a 20 or 30 year lifespan is pretty amazing. And so hasn't been a whole lot of security and hacking related information about mainframes. Yes, it exists, but it's not something we talk about all the time. And again, I don't read a lot of articles about mainframe pen testing, but this one I thought was really awesome. But again, I don't have a lot to compare it against, because I'm not, reading articles every week about, mainframe pen testing. But based on my limited experience, I was like, oh, that's really awesome. And one of the things that shined through was, like, there's still Telnet on these devices. I'm like,
well,
are we serious? Like, there's still
absolutely.
Telnet. There's still, but it oftentimes is not Telnet. It's 3270, TN3270.
Well, I was going to say, it's technically not Telnet. It's TN3270, which is a terminal emulator, because mainframes go way back to the way you communicated with a mainframe was with a dumb terminal that was just connected, hardwired
right
to the mainframe.
But it's not the character. Well, does anyone know
back
the
in the day?
What is the character encoding called on a
Absidic.
main? Yes, thank you, Lee.
Absidic.
Lee for the win. Ding, 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 ding.
They,
Obscure protocols for 500.
yes.
But
So
go ahead, Lee.
I was going to say I wouldn't characterize those as dumb terminals. Your VT220 was a dumb
EBCDIC isn't
terminal.
a protocol; it's a character encoding. So
Right.
ASCII and or EBCDIC, right?
Right, and they had all kinds of
they were semi-educated terminals.
Yes.
I have a really quick funny story when I was analyzing traffic at the university when we had some of the first like snort and TCP dump sensors, and I was like, "Why is there encrypted traffic going over port 23?" I'm like, that's really weird. It wasn't encrypted; it was EBCDIC. It's hilarious.
Yeah, it's just
hilarious.
a different protocol. Yeah, I mean, I ran into a lot of mainframes back in the early days of my private sector pen testing career. I actually rooted a mainframe one time, much the same way this article describes.
Yeah,
because I simply, we were doing an on-site pen test of it was a natural gas company, and I found, we were knocking all, it was back in the Unix days, so we were knocking over Unix servers, and the guys I was working with, they were just, what else can I root? And I was like, hey, let's stop at this system and let's see what kind of information's on there. And I found a mail directory for an admin, and I found in his mailbox a file that said passwords. So I opened it up, and there was the mainframe admin password. And I'm like, I wonder if this will work. So I had to like find a TN3270 emulator, download it, install it, pointed it at the mainframe, put in the credentials. I was in. So
there you go.
I rooted a mainframe, and I'm like, I had no idea what to do at that point, because I'm like, I didn't know any of the any of the commands or anything, but I was root on a mainframe. But there was other mainframes that I ran into.
You should have a T-shirt that says "I was root on a mainframe." That would just be a great.
I should
t-shirt.
do that.
It should be encoded in like EBCDIC, so you have to decode.
I love that idea. I think I might do that. But I did another pen test for it was a government facility. It was a major shared, it was MSRC, major shared major shared computing resources or something like that. But they had like all the mainframes of the day, and they were doing like real edgy stuff. This was back in like the 90s, and they had tandems, they had the VAX VMS and Cray. They had all the mainframes, and they're doing.
I wouldn't call VAX VMS necessarily a mainframe.
Well,
an awesome operating system.
Well, whatever it was that was running on it, I don't. They had 4. I don't remember all of them, but I mean, the way that we got onto them initially was the fact that they all had a TCP/IP stack running on them. So, as soon as you could telnet and do anything TCP/IP related, you could run all over them. But getting into the operating system and the command language, I mean, you worked with the 4690s, Paul, very much.
4690 was like an esoteric point of sale. Well, I guess it would be esoteric now. It was more of the standard for a point of sale operating system in the 90s.
But I mean, very rudimentary operating systems, very few commands. So there was like, what do you do with it?
It was almost like an embedded system or IoT device where it's specialty purpose built for a specific application, which is interesting to think about.
Pretty much. Well, and mainframes back in the day, and even to this day, they're still around because they do something well. They, financial institutions use it because they can process lots and lots of transactions and transfers.
Databases,
largely
databases, right? The mainframes. I know AS400s were awesome at running like IBM DB2.
Yep.
I want to say the mainframe was that also a thing?
There was certainly a database functionality on it. I don't know. I don't remember what they were, but I mean, they used to be the crown jewel,
process
back in the old days of the 3-tier architecture, and all your data was on a mainframe. If you could get to the mainframe, that's where all the data was, and there was no encryption on it. If you could get there and you knew the commands,
you literally hacked the Gibson.
I literally hacked the Gibson.
So
I should check my archive to find it. I don't know what mainframe it was that I hacked. I should try to dig through my archive and figure that
It
out.
was probably was it OS 390? I don't know. Back then, was it?
Or even VM.
Yes, you're right. There was a progression from VM to OS 390. I remember. I think that was. And it's funny you say that, Lee. I think that was the upgrade that I was working in security for the university, was the VM based mainframe to the OS 390 based mainframe.
Yeah.
Yep. But I mean, the article, I mean, it most of the hacking that's going on is talking about finding credentials from some other sources and using them to get on. There's not even a whole lot of elevating privileges in the article.
Well, that gets into like RAC F and in the privileges.
RAC F and ACF2 were this was the security layer. I think it was the same client. I had hired a guy as a contractor. He was supposedly a mainframe ACF2 expert, and he was going to do the security review for us. Unfortunately, he stopped communicating, and at some point I tried calling him, and I got his wife on the phone, and she's like, "Oh, I'm so sorry. He had a heart attack and died." And she was so apologetic that he couldn't finish the job, and I'm like,
because he died.
That's not an issue. We'll figure it out. But holy crap! But yeah, he was like the last expert on ACF2 apparently.
Hey, Bill, changing gears quick. Have you run Kismet in like a while?
Not in a long, long time, but I'm interested to hear about this article. I saw it on your list.
So story number 12 is Black Hills Information Security published an article about like basically up and running with Kismet. Larry and I would spend hours and hours and hours running Kismet with all different devices back in the day, right? And then I took a long break from that, and I kind of dabble with it here and there. And so when I saw this article, I was like, oh, maybe I'll dabble. Like I'm writing an article, but like I need to take a break from that and do something different and then go back to it with a fresh perspective. So I'm like, in the background, I read this article. I'm like, Mike Kershaw's done an amazing job in keeping Kismet up to date. Like, I mean, when I say amazing, like you can install it on so many different Linux distributions now, and it's in the package management system. It's just simply amazing what he's done with it. And so I was like,
I remember it, but I don't. What is Kismet for those of us that are younger?
It's a wireless analysis tool, so that you can use a Wi-Fi card or USB dongle, and using Kismet, you can see everything that's happening within the wireless spectrum. And Mike Kershaw is the author of Draghorn, is his handle, the author of Kismet. Awesome person. We should have him back on the show. And he's extended that so that it does Bluetooth and Bluetooth low energy and all these different protocols. So he had a thing where you can connect an Ubertooth 1 to Kismet, and I failed miserably getting that working. It was actually kind of hilarious because at home, I didn't have any USB wireless cards that were supported by Kismet because they were all here in the studio. Because Larry and I had gone through like my kit. He was like, dude, that shit's old. Like, put that in a drawer, put it away. Like, this is the only one you need. And it was here in the studio. But at home, I had an Ubertooth 1. So I'm like, well, maybe I can get that working. And I failed miserably. No fault of Kismet or whatever. I failed miserably.
Your fault.
My fault. Totally my fault. So then I got here in the studio where I had my, the Larry recommended alpha USB Wi-Fi card, right? That he's like, that's the one you want. And I plugged it in, and it worked. Like I ran Kismet-C WLAN 0, and magically everything worked, and it was beautiful. And then I was like, what is it? So now here in the studio, we're in like a kind of commercial, I don't know, you guys have all been in the studio, right? There's a lot of businesses and whatever around here. And so I saw a couple of interesting SSIDs. One was connect here for viruses. And I'm like, Larry, did you like leave something in the studio for me to connect to? I'm like, that's awesome. I didn't connect to it, but also like I want viruses. Like
free
viruses are awesome. Free viruses. I'm in, totally in. And the other one I saw recently was called Wu-Tang. Because
and you got excited.
it's Wi-Fi is for the children, apparently. So kind of just a reminder that Kismet's still awesome and does a lot of cool things.
You reminded me of a project I did where I took Kismet and had it monitoring for a little bit. It would pick up all the preferred SIDs that were being broadcast by things in the area. And then I would go take those SIDs and look them up on Wiggle and dynamically generate a map of where people around me had been.
Yeah.
Right.
By where their preferred hotspots were.
Yeah, dude, ton of people's vehicles. Like I totally, because all cars today have like Wi-Fi hotspots, and not all, but most have that. It's totally like, you know, Jesse's Chevrolet or whatever. Like, so I those could be people driving by.
Paul's
because I have
Tesla?
the, you know, the Alpha. No, so Teslas don't have a friggin' hotspot.
Well, my
You
wife's
believe
car
that
does,
shit?
but I don't know why.
My kids are like,
where,
where's the hotspot? I'm like, no, dude, I get a hotspot off my phone. Like, there is no hotspot. They're like, Dad, you're the like world's biggest nerd. Like, are you serious? You can't make the Tesla happen. I'm like, no. Like, I read on the internet tells me it's not there, and I've researched it multiple times. It's not there. So look out the window like I did when I was a kid.
So the funny thing about that, Paul, is I'm
Play
thinking,
the alphabet game.
Right?
The cellular hotspot in your car. I mean, the hotspot in your car is cellular based, right? It's based on what the cell towers around it can see will deliver, which is what your phone is already doing. So why we have a middleman? Why not just use your phone?
Yeah, because like Tesla. So like Tesla does have their LTE, but that's just for Tesla for cars to communicate. It doesn't present a hotspot for the people in it, which is in a lot. I mean, if you want to go read online about people being like really upset, go read about that. And you'll find a lot
from what
of
I
people
understand,
really
it's because of they negotiated a throughput rate, right? Like, you know, it's
correct.
it's mainly done.
So I get more bandwidth.
Stats. Yeah. Well, it's for stats for the car, right?
Well, and and they're like, well, do we want every people's kids watching YouTube over? No.
Yeah.
No,
because we'll exceed our cap, right?
The minute you tell people don't connect a video conference call on the airplane Wi-Fi, they do.
It's true.
Oh, but of course. Oh, I had one. So I added specific stories, so we're not talking about firmware and IoT all the time. I did. So I added one about my story number 11. Leaked environment variables allow large-scale extortion operation of cloud environments. So this is something that like I lived, right? So when you develop an application, usually when you're doing it in containers, right? Your containers need certain like credentials,
like API keys and
database credentials.
That's
right? Like how do I put my like how does my application server log into the database? Where does it get that credentials from? The quick and easy hack when you're in development in your container is to create a .env file. So once the container is instantiated, it pulls in those environment variables, and in your code, you read those environment variables from Linux, and it says your database username is this, and your password is this, right? And there's
easy peasy,
all kinds of like also it's easy, but also there's safeguards to one, make sure your .env files don't end up in your Git repository. So like I would have the ones that were committed to the Git repository basically had like blank strings. And then in your deployment scripts would then populate those with the actual credentials for the database and would not put those in Git. The other thing is you want to make sure your .env files are not in a web server path where someone can hit a URL and read your env files. So like if you use them properly, it's not horrible security, but it's not great. But what attackers figured out, given the proliferation of applications that are out there, what if I were to go hit every URL endpoint and see if there's a .env file? Well, lo and behold, if they automate that process, they can find thousands of applications that they can dump the env files. So what they do is they take those credentials for whatever they are, for your S3 buckets, for your API endpoints, for your databases, and they go suck down all of that data, and then they hold it for ransom. And I'm like, well, of course that's a thing, because the real answer is to use a secrets vault. right?
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
here we get into like we were talking about like in vulnerability management, right? Like at what point do you take a timeout in your development to go, I don't want to store my secrets in a .env file. I want to use a secrets vault. And now I have to retrofit my code so that I'm pulling those secrets from a secrets vault, which requires some architecture and planning.
Yeah.
So
And
I've done that.
I've actually done this
Me too.
development, right?
Yep.
And you've got a lot of options, right? You're like, well, env files are really easy, and if I secure them properly, I don't have an immediate issue. However, I know that the right answer is to use a secrets vault. So you can use an AWS secret. AWS has multiple ways in which you can implement some kind of, down to your SSL certificates to any kind of secret. There's at least 3 or 4 different ways you can implement that in AWS, and you should. But also you can use an external vault, like HashiCorp makes an open source one. That's the most popular one. If you want to go commercial, CyberArk makes a great secrets vault. But again, that requires that you retrofit your application to use these secrets vaults, and that's enough of a barrier where people are using .env files. Attackers were like, well, I can just enumerate all of that, and then I can basically ransom all of these applications, and that's what they did. So the PSA is, I get it. Like env files are super convenient and you can secure them to a certain point, but once your application reaches like a certain stage, you really need to implement a secrets vault. And yes, it's kind of a pain in the butt, but again, like doing that earlier in the development process is going to be so much better than getting far down the path, tens of thousands of lines of code going, yeah, now I'm going to implement a secrets vault. Now you've got a lot of like retrofitting to do and a lot of coding to do that. So
Next thing you
it
know,
was
you're
an
going to tell
it was
me
an
I
interesting
can't put the
attack. Like,
credentials for my secrets vault in a .env file, right?
well, yeah, it does. To your point, Lee, it's a great point. Like, you do need to manage like some kind of secret, right? Like to access the vault, you need a secret, but it's very well documented how to do this in a way that doesn't like offer a lot of those different exposures. So,
Paul,
Bill, I'm sure you've done
wouldn't your younger self have proposed exactly that though?
right? We totally need to use secrets vaults, but I'm like, you know what? In development, I'm like, yeah, the database credentials are in a env file. It's fine.
Yeah,
It's totally fine. But I'm sure in like instant response, like you've done the, oh yeah, we leak secrets somewhere where we shouldn't have, and we're planning on like phasing that out, but we haven't gotten around to it yet because again, you're not squashing a bug or implementing a feature, you're doing infrastructure work.
Yeah.
Right. And like when I work with product managers, they're like, well, this is just like infrastructure. I'm like, dude, I totally get it. Like sometimes you got to take a time out and you got to improve the architecture and the infrastructure. And this is a case where people didn't and they got bit.
Yeah.
I've got a lot to say there, but like you're absolutely right. Secrets are a very important thing and they need to be treated. They need to be kept a secret. Like,
Right. Yeah.
So it's not just a clever name.
Yeah.
No, it's again, like to Bill's point, like there's a clear path to a solution, but the solution requires a little architecture and a little work. And that's enough of a barrier to go, I don't know, we'll do that someday. Like right now, I need to get the latest feature out, or I need to squash the latest bug, or I need to patch this other vulnerability. I need to, in my case, I need to convert from Python 2 to Python 3. That takes way more priority than implementing a secrets vault. So I get it,
comes.
but like PSA, you should do this because now attackers are like, oh well, they can just ransom you and get access to all your stuff. And the article goes through like in very highly detailed accounts of how attackers were able to basically get all of your data and hold it for ransom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What else we got?
Let's see here. How about something else on Jeff's list? Anything you wanted to hit?
Your number 5, Jeff, seemed pretty intriguing. The offensive security.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, I wasn't sure if we wanted to go there or not, but It was an article about
Yeah,
how
it flirts with the political line, but I'm fine with it.
it does flirt with the political line. The point I simply wanted to make was, I always get a little bit agitated when I hear people talking about offensive security and defensive security, and I do offense. I'm like, offensive security is kind of what nation states do, and there's real consequences. It's like war, and this was just a really good example of apparently some sort of hack of a communication system where they fooled a guy into, and I forget the name of the guy, but most wanted terrorist type of person, but somebody called him and said, you need to go to your apartment, and then they launched an attack and took him out and most of his family. I'm like, that's offensive security. It's what you do when you're fighting a war and people die, not, well, I'm on the red team, I'm on the blue team, I do offense. It's
Yeah, but
get off my lawn type of moment. But everything we do is defensive.
There's a lot of people I call on to like explain the political climate when it comes to like cyber operations, but in the context of a political climate that happens in the Middle East. Like there's I feel like there's a lot of knowledge gaps there, and I've tried to listen to different podcasts and read and educate myself about that, but I'm never as up to date as those that have like served in the U.S. forces and been immersed in that. Some of my friends have done that, and I kind of lean on them. I'm like, dude, like what's going on? Like what is Hezbollah, and how does that play into like what's happening today?
Well,
Hezbollah is but that's like Lebanon that affiliates with Iran. It's a faction that has a deep, rich history, but like to explain that to most people don't know, like couldn't explain that basically.
That's very true. And my point is we throw the term offensive security around very casually in our industry.
Yeah.
And I spent the week in Vegas and I talked to all sorts of people. Oh, I do offense. I'm like, no, you're not really doing offense if you're still doing defense, because offense is kind of what the government does and what the military does. That it's very different. And I just thought this article was a good illustration of, no, this is what offensive security is.
Yes.
It's when you take out an adversary
right
by doing hacking things.
Right.
We could talk hypothetically about things that are in the past. I mean, it's not computer internet stuff, but like in Vietnam, when we were fighting the Vietnam, it wasn't technically a war, political, but a lot of the Viet Cong, the communists, the North Vietnamese, they were educated in Europe and in America, and they had grown up in America. They spoke English, they spoke fluent English, and they didn't have an accent. And there was a really big problem in Vietnam with the Viet Cong calling in airstrikes. Calling the legitimate U.S. forces, say, hey, here's the grid coordinates, go take these out. Well, and they're like, well, they sound American, they're speaking perfect English, but they weren't. And so they were calling in strikes against U.S. troops. I mean, that's essentially, that's similar to what this article is talking about. It's a hack by definition, but it's offensive in nature, and it's during a period of war and armed conflict, and it's taking people out. So I just wanted to put this article out there just to illustrate offensive security is not a term we should use lightly, in my opinion. It's something that's very legitimate with national defense, and there's organizations we've talked about this evening on the first segment that in the second segment that do this stuff. Everybody else that's working for a company and they're like, well, I'm on the blue team, I'm on the red team, and I do offense and I do defense. Yeah. There's more to it.
And they do in that context, but you're talking about it's more of a geopolitical context.
I'm just saying there's a meaning to terms, and offensive security is it's an oxymoron as far as I'm concerned. Security by definition is defense.
Right. I lean on our friends that worked in intelligence when they worked for the armed forces, right? Like yourself and so
like
many
me,
others, right? Yeah, yeah. And I'm like, explain this to, because they were educated on how all that stuff worked, right? And
Mm-hmm.
what a lot of us here in the US are very ignorant to that. And like it takes work, because like the main, also in our defense, the mainstream press does a horrible job of explaining what's happening in all these different countries, right? In all these different
Right.
conflicts to us. They pick and choose as part of a political agenda.
Yep.
Like it's
Sure.
not great news outlets that are talking about Libya, in Syria, in all of the different context, right? That relates back to cybersecurity, because a lot of our friends, right, like that I talked to, were like, well, yeah, I was an intelligence operator and now I work in cybersecurity, and I have that background of like what was happening
Right.
in these various areas. And that's often like it's interesting. It's an information gap that
Well, I
we
guess,
have.
yeah. I mean, along those lines, I guess what I'm saying is those of us that have actually worked in the intelligence field and worked in times of actual armed conflict, offensive security has a very specific, sobering meaning, because it's there's human lives involved typically. And
Right.
to throw the term around in our industry, and yeah, a lot of it's, I mean, how many terms do we take as sacrosanct in our industry today, and we try to do I always get the term, it's either etymology or entomology. One's bugs and one's meanings of words. But you go back to it, and it's like, totally different from what we're throwing the word around. But we consider it sacrosanct, and a lot of it's come from not only media but marketing. You know, on a lighter note, multi-factor authentication. That's one that's bugged me for a while, but because it's two-factor authentication, that's what we used to
Yeah,
call
but
it.
it's a great segue though, because Lee, you had a story about Microsoft, and I saw this
Yeah.
one.
Yeah, there we go.
Microsoft wants to enforce, it is enforcing, not
Yeah.
Yeah.
they want to, but they are enforcing multi-factor authentication for what looks to me like administrative functions in Azure
Initially,
AD,
yes.
or
Yes.
Azure and or Azure AD, but
Mhm.
also that seems like it's going to continue to enforce multi-factor authentication, much like we've seen in GitHub and many others, forcing people to enable multi-factor authentication, which I think is kind of a good thing, right? Like
Right.
I think it's a practice that many of us have. Like, if any one of us were to go into our authenticator app of choice on our phones, we would have a pretty long list. Like, thankfully, my Google Authenticator has a search,
Yep.
because I've got so many in there. I'm like, yes, like enable that, like 1,000%. Also,
Right.
there's the weird cases where there's several different forms of that second factor, if you will, or whatever factor you want to call it, a factor above and beyond a password.
Mm-hmm.
You can fall back to a text message or whatever. But I don't think we pay enough attention to multi-factor in how it's configured. I like
No.
the authenticator apps as the second factor, but oftentimes they'll fall back to a more insecure mechanism for that other factor in addition to your password.
Yeah, and that means somebody trying to hack in could select that alternate mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a chance, I would not enable SMS or phone call based verification if you can. If it's the only
Agreed.
option you
That takes
got,
some
it's
work. It
better than
takes some
just a
work
password.
today.
Oh,
Look,
I
I'm the
know.
first to admit I haven't done a great job of disabling those. Because the worst case is you don't want to get locked out. Like the worst case
Correct.
scenario is you don't want to get locked out. But Google's done a great job, I will say, of not just having the authenticator app, but also some of the ways I authenticate are it'll send a push notification to my Android phone
Mhm.
and go like,
Is
do
this
you
you?
approve this
Yeah.
log? Microsoft even does that too, right? Like,
Yep.
do you
Yeah.
approve this login? I
Yes.
want to see it be that in place of any kind of SMS or phone call, to your point, Lee.
Me too.
Right. And they've got a
Well,
bunch of
Paul,
options. Go ahead.
call me old fashioned, but I hate it that I can't do things on my laptop sometimes unless I have my phone next to me.
Phone, right? You
And
need your phone.
it just I get it, but it still bugs me. It's especially bad when I I try to like, okay, I'm going to do some work on an airplane, so I want to like connect to the Wi-Fi and then connect to stuff. And like, oh, I got to do the multi-factor authentication. I'm like, shit, I got to pay another $10 to connect my phone so I can get the push.
Right.
And then then I try going the alternate route. Well, we'll send you an email to this, and I'm like, oh shit, I can't do the phone MFA to get on my email. So I got to do the email to another email, and I go to that email, and I'm trying to log on to that, and at some point I give up.
I know. I want to get rid of email and SMS as a factor in my authentication in favor of three things: the authenticator app, the push to my phone, and my physical token, like my YubiKey.
Yeah.
Right. But like doing that across all of your apps is like a daunting task. I'm like,
So
oh, hold on. Let me put in for PTO for like 2 or 3 days so I can go configure all my shit to do just that, right? Because email and SMS
security
and
is
phone calls.
Security is such a pain.
It shouldn't be that hard. I think your point, right? Like it shouldn't be that hard.
I think it's interesting that you didn't mention FIDO2 or like passkeys.
Well, actually,
right?
Passkeys in other.
See where I'm pointing on the screen where it says FIDO2? It's in the article. So I was going to say the challenge at an enterprise level is you've got all these strong authenticators, and you got a YubiKey, you got a smart card, and you got a phone, and you want to have synchronized across them all the same identity, so which matter one the user has in their hand works.
Right.
And that's an interesting challenge, and that takes us into the world of derived credentials. But yeah, it's and in fact, these are where I'm prototyping. I have a derived credentials here, and derived credentials there, and they all work interchangeably.
Yeah, derived is a trigger word for me. So let's move on.
Sorry, but
it's not real crypto if it's derived.
No.
Well, speaking of your phone, my story number 10 is really concerning to me, and I thought this was kind of like misreported, but because it was talked about in context of firmware. Like Pixel firmware has a vulnerability and it can't be patched. And when I dug into it, there was an Android application that was installed as part of the firmware that goes on Pixel phones. And I was like, what is that? And I dug in a little more and I was like, oh, that's kind of like I have an IoT device and it has firmware, and there's applications that get installed in userland that are just part of the firmware. And so on Android, that means there's an APK. And we've all seen the Android apps that, like, the reason I don't run Samsung as my platform is because they incorporate Android apps that are basically what I call crapware that I can't remove, that are doing God knows what on my platform. And so I'm like, well, I'm going to go with Google because they install less crapware. But it turns out that Google has authorized folks like Verizon to include what's called a showcase APK, showcase application. And the purpose of that Android app is to allow Verizon to put phones in like a demo mode to be on their like display,
at the store.
Yeah. So like in your store, like you pick up a phone in the store.
Yeah.
It's like totally like you can use stuff, but you really can't, kind of thing, because it's in demo mode. But that application that's allowing you to do that has a high privilege level and is baked into the firmware. And I'm like, God, I'm like, that's bad. But it turns out that application has vulnerabilities. Oh, interesting. And that's my story number 10. And so it allows, so it's disabled by default, but it allows for applying configuration updates over HTTP. I'm like, oh, well,
of course it does.
That's really bad. And there's multiple other vulnerabilities associated with this particular application. And that's why you see the headlines like Pixel firmware has been compromised. It's because this APK has been included in the firmware. And again, not the first time on Android where, like, I look at a lot of cheap Chinese Android phones and I'm always skeptical, like, what software are they including in this phone that gives all their people access to the phone? And it's because of these like weird applications. And the reason I go with Google Pixel is because I believe they have the lowest instance of this type of application, except in this case. I mean, the workaround, you got to root your Android phone to get rid of this application, but like you can't root every single Pixel device that's out there, right? Some of the recent ones you can, but like also you could end up with a brick if you're trying to root your Pixel phone. And my Pixel phone is my primary driver, right? I don't want to break that device. So it's
I'm hoping somebody at Smith Micro wakes up and says, it's 2024. Why are we not using HTTPS?
Right.
I
that
mean,
was the
it
company
used
that
to be
made
the-
this app, right? That again, I believe was there so they could put it in a demo mode.
Yeah.
In Verizon stores.
Yeah. What do you mean you're not deleting it when you deliver the device to humans?
Yeah, they should. I agree 1,000%, Lee. This app should not be in the production Pixel firmware image. It should just be in a firmware image that only gets the phones that are displayed in the Verizon store, and production phones should not have this image. Google can fix this issue pretty easily, in my opinion.
But it was a really big check, Paul. I expect this is financially a whole lot at stake.
Right.
But I agree with you. Technically, this should be a solvable problem. We've spent more time on it than it would probably take to fix.
Right.
But yeah.
Closing out stories for this week. There was a critical vulnerability in OpenBMC. This one was kind of interesting. So, BMCs are baseboard management controllers that exist in your servers, and typically we see those. If anyone's familiar, most of us, right, would be familiar with the terms of HP ILO, Integrated Lights Out Management, Dell iDRAC. I don't remember what does iDRAC. What does DRAC stand for? There's been a ton of different IBM. IBM has its IBM basically implements OpenBMC. And again, the BMC or baseboard management controller is the most privileged level of code that runs on your system. And this firm, what was their name?
Integrated Dell Remote Access Controller.
There you go. Tetril did an evaluation of the OpenBMC code and found, from everything that I've read, and smarter people than I have kind of weighed in on this as to how exploitable this is. It's a heap-based buffer overflow, totally exploitable in the SLDP Lite service, which again is like a service discovery service, very similar to Apple's Bonjour or Universal Plug and Play. And when I say those terms, people go, "Oh my God!" Like take security and throw it out the window, kind of thing. So there was a buffer overflow in that process. No one's really talking about this vulnerability, which is really kind of interesting. But an attacker that can leverage this particular vulnerability gains a high level, like the highest level of privilege on a particular device. Again, it goes back to our vulnerability discussion in the previous segment, right? Like, how do you categorize and prioritize remediation? Yeah. And if you base that on impact, one of the conversations I had with one of our researchers at Eclipsium on a Below the Surface episode podcast was, you know, if you were to exploit a vulnerability in a BMC, you could force the computer to go into an infinite reboot loop that did not provide the user, who even could sit physically at the system, with the means to break out of that reboot loop. Like, that's how critical and privileged the BMC code lives. It's like a chip that has hooks into all of the hardware in your system and can load independently of all the other hardware and software on your system. And so here we have a buffer overflow in that particular management interface, which is just, it's mind blowing to me that this didn't get more press than it did.
Hey, if you got room for one more story, it's sort of,
more.
I think it's sort of a nice wrap up to our theme tonight. My story number 2 about Oracle NetSuite.
I saw this one.
Base install installs a web browser unbeknownst to the user, and you got to know to disable it or turn it off. So feature or bug or vulnerability or just a misconfiguration issue. But
And NetSuite is a enterprise application used by many. There have been organizations we've worked for together, Jeff, that ran NetSuite. That's how I learned of that software.
Yep. I thought this is an interesting article, for, and before we add our conversation throughout the evening, first segment and second segment, but the fact that it was more an implementation issue. You had to know to turn things off, to disable, but it was an undocumented feature where it launches out of the box, as it were, with a web browser that if you know about it, you can go to it and do all sorts of nasty things like stealing data. Risk,
awesome.
patch, it's complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah, a non-secure default website. Nice.
Yep.
That's kind of like a default password, only easier.
Kind of. And like, it's 2024. I thought we got past all this out of the box plug and play stuff a long time ago.
One would think.
Awesome. Anything else you guys wanted to cover?
I'm good.
I'm taking a quick last look.
Lee, we talked about your story number 1 in our first segment.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Actually, I was actually thinking about you as we've talked about analyzed CVE. So I'm glad you covered that in the first segment.
Yep.
And
we covered CVEs and CVSS and all kinds of stuff. So
yeah, no, I think we did a nice swath across all of these, and so I think we should call it a night.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for listening and watching to this edition of Paul Security Weekly. Over and out. See you next time.